Nick Reiner, the son accused of murdering his celebrity parents in cold blood in their Los Angeles mansion, was allegedly lying in wait as he prepared to kill them. That is just some of the new information coming in from the district attorney's office as we break down the newly unsealed indictment against Reiner, all of the information that we hadn't known, and all of the information we are learning just now. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. When the bodies of renowned actor and filmmaker Rob Reiner and his producer wife Michele were found just before Christmas of last year, it shocked the world. I mean, think back to that time when this story first broke. And then when we learned the identity of their alleged killer, I mean, that was almost more shocking. The fact it was their own child, 32-year-old Nick. Investigators claim that Nick Reiner stabbed his parents to death at their home in Brentwood, which is a affluent part of Los Angeles. And then he allegedly just took off. And he was found not long after in another part of LA, Exposition Park, and he was charged with 2 counts of murder, and he's been locked up at LA's Twin Towers Correctional Facility. Now, you may already know a lot of that information by this point, but now we're learning some new allegations as a brand new indictment has been unsealed in Reiner's case. So I want to walk through what we're learning and a quick timeline as well of how we got here. Now, 78-year-old Rob Reiner, famous director and actor. And then you have his wife, who is a very famous producer, Michele Reiner. She was 70 years old. They were killed on December 14th. And this couple was supposed to have a massage therapy appointment at their home. When the therapist showed up, though, they couldn't get into the house, couldn't get anybody to come to the door. So the massage therapist, ends up calling the Reiner's youngest daughter. And that's Nick Reiner's sister. And she has to go into that house. And she makes a horrific discovery that her parents had allegedly been stabbed to death. Now, Nick Reiner was arrested hours later. Surveillance video from a gas station shows him buying a drink and really showing no sign emotionally that we can tell that he allegedly had just killed his own parents. TMZ also reports that Reiner fled to a hotel in Santa Monica after the murder. Now, prosecutors filed formal criminal charges on December 16th. And Reiner's arraignment, it was pushed back a couple times, but in February, he was in court and his public defender entered a not guilty plea on his behalf.
And on behalf of Mr. Reiner, do you waive full reading of the complaint, advisement of rights, including armed forces and veterans' rights, enter a plea of not guilty, denying any and all special allegations, enhancements, and priors?
Yes, Your Honor.
A plea of not guilty is entered on behalf of Mr. Reiner.
Now, the next big step in this case was a preliminary hearing where the prosecution could lay out some of the evidence that they have against Reiner, and the judge would decide if there was enough to take this case to trial. But that won't need to happen now because a grand jury returned an indictment against Nick Reiner. The jury had been meeting in secret and actually made their decision in July, but the paperwork was just unsealed on Wednesday. So I want to take a closer look at what it says. You have count 1. And it goes on to say, quote, the said Nick Reiner is accused by the grand jury of the County of Los Angeles, State of California, by this indictment of the crime of first-degree murder. On or about December 14th, 2025, in the County of Los Angeles, said Nick Reiner, who did unlawfully and with malice aforethought murder Michele Reiner, a human being. And for count 2, a further and separate cause of action being a different offense of the same class of crimes and offenses as the charge set forth in the aforestated count hereof. The said Nick Reiner is accused by the grand jury of the County of Los Angeles, State of California, by this indictment of the crime of first-degree murder on or about December 14th, 2025, in the County of Los Angeles. The said Nick Reiner, who did unlawfully and with malice aforethought murder Robert Reiner, a human being. The indictment also listed special circumstances allegations, which are aggravating factors that can be tacked onto a charge. So going back to this indictment, it says it is further alleged as to counts 1 and 2 that the murders of Michele Reiner and Rob Reiner were committed by the said defendant Nick Reiner, and that defendant intentionally killed the victims by means of lying in wait. Goes on to say, quote, it is further alleged as to counts 1 and 2 that in the commission or attempted commission of the above offense, the said defendant, Nick Reiner, personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, to wit, a knife. Now, we knew from autopsy reports that Rob and Michele died from sharp force injuries, but the information about Reiner allegedly lying in wait is certainly new. Reiner pleaded not guilty to the indictment this week. He's still behind bars with no bond, and his time in jail, it has not been easy, and we'll get more into that in just a moment. A pretrial hearing is scheduled for September 15th. Now, Nick Reiner is one of the defendants featured in our case files on the Law&Crime Plus app, so I do have a special code to get you free access for a month. It unlocks exclusive access, which puts you right in the evidence room with jail calls, interrogation videos, body camera recordings, and court documents from the biggest cases in true crime. Plus, you get to watch shows from both Law and Crime and Court TV ad-free. So head over to lawandcrimeplus.com. You enter promo code on the case and claim your free month right now. So with the public release of the indictment, Los Angeles County DA Nathan Hochman noted the seriousness of the charges and the horror of what happened that day. He said, quote, "This was a profound betrayal by someone who is loved and trusted by the very people he is accused of killing." The indictment, unsealed Wednesday, also adds a special circumstance allegation that the defendant committed the murders by means of lying in wait. We hope that by having a grand jury return an indictment in this case, it will bring us one step closer to a trial and achieving justice. Hochman also spoke about special circumstances after Reiner's hearing in February and whether or not his office planned to pursue the death penalty.
We will be looking at all aggravating and mitigating circumstances, and we have invited defense counsel to present to us both in writing and orally in a meeting any arguments that they would like to make in consideration for our going forward or not going forward with the death penalty. So that is an ongoing process. We will also, at that point, when we get all this information, it will be subject to not only a rigorous analysis, but many of the most experienced individuals in the DA's office with death penalty experience will be helping me evaluate that information.
Now, the DA's office reiterated that it is still considering which direction to go when it comes to the death penalty. And we do want to point out that California's had a moratorium on capital punishment for years, but a defendant can still face death row in California. So if Reiner is found guilty, it is possible he could be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and it's still being determined whether or not the death penalty is on the table. Now, another storyline that's playing out in this case is how Nick Reiner is going to be able to pay for his defense, because he wants access to his trust fund to help pay his legal fees. Now, when Reiner was first arrested, you might remember he hired, one of the biggest names in criminal defense, Alan Jackson. You remember him as the defense attorney for Karen Reed. He hired Jackson to represent him, but then Jackson ends up withdrawing. The exact details as to why Jackson withdrew from the case, it's unclear, but it is believed it likely had to do with whether or not Reiner would actually be able to pay some pretty hefty legal fees that Alan Jackson would certainly charge. And that theory was confirmed in the large petition filed with the court. So here's what Jackson said at the time.
This morning, I had to withdraw as Nick Reiner's counsel. Circumstances beyond our control, but more importantly, circumstances beyond Nick's control, have dictated that, sadly, it's made it impossible for us to continue our representation of Nick. I'm legally and I'm ethically prohibited from explaining all the reasons why. I know that's a question on everybody's mind. We expect the public defender to step in. They've already been appointed and very capably protect Nick Reiner's interests as he moves forward through the system. But be clear, be very, very clear about this. My team and I remain deeply, deeply committed to Nick Reiner and to his best interests. In fact, we know, we're not just convinced, we know that the legal process will reveal the true facts of the circumstances surrounding this case, Nick's case. You know, a lot's been printed of late, over the last 3 weeks. A lot has been printed about Nick, printed about his family, printed about the circumstances. Speculation is in print. On December 15th, in the early morning hours, I was in New York at the time, and I got a call me and my team, we dropped everything. And for the last 3 weeks, we have devoted literally every waking hour to protecting Nick and his interests. We've investigated this matter top to bottom, back to front. What we've learned, and you can take this to the bank, is that pursuant to the laws of this state, pursuant to the law in California, Nick Reiner is not guilty of murder. Print that. Print that. We wish him the very, very best moving forward. And that's all I have today.
Reiner filed a petition for access to his trust fund, which the victims in this case set up for him decades ago, to the tune of reportedly $1.5 million. Now, obviously, the Reiners had a lot of money from decades of success in the film industry. The Los Angeles Times obtained the filing, which says in part, Nick loved his parents and he is devastated by their deaths. But the facts about what did and did not happen to them are not at issue in this trust litigation. Nick's criminal defense attorneys will present those facts in the criminal case. This petition neither requires nor invites this court to weigh in on them. Like anyone accused of a crime, Nick is presumed innocent, and he is entitled to mount his defense with the resources that are lawfully his own. The terms of Nick's trust are not complicated. They are not subject to reasonable dispute. Nick's parents left unambiguous instructions about when the funds in the trust were to be released to him. 1/2 of the trust was required to be distributed to Nick outright when he turned 30. They further instructed that when he turned 35, he would receive the rest of the funds in his trust. These distributions are mandatory and unconditional. So age is an interesting part of this because Nick's now 32, but according to his civil attorneys, he didn't get money from the trust when he was 30 before his parents died because there were questions about his competency. Nick Reiner has been open that he has struggled with issues of addiction in his life, which reportedly date back to when he was just a teenager. He'd also reportedly been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But thus far, Reiner's competency has not been an issue in his criminal case, so his civil attorneys say he is entitled to his trust fund. But what's known as the Slayer statute under California law could come into play here. So I want to read this statute for you. A person who feloniously or intentionally kills the decedent is not entitled to any of the following: any property, interest, or benefit under a will of the decedent, or a trust created by or for the benefit of the decedent, or in which the decedent has an interest, including any general or special power of appointment conferred by the will or trust on the killer, and any nomination of the killer as executor, trustee, guardian, or conservator or custodian made by the will or trust. So not only do we have the news of the indictment this week, but next week, Monday, August 17th, a judge is scheduled to hear arguments for and against Reiner's petition. In the meantime, Reiner still has no bond, and he is currently at the LA County Twin Towers Correctional Facility. And we're told he's housed alone in a medical observation unit at the jail. There were sources who reportedly told People magazine that Reiner has been disciplined in jail. It happened back in April after he allegedly became extremely hostile toward deputies who were taking him back to his cell after a shower. Now, evidently, there was some kind of delay, and when he wasn't allowed to immediately go back to his cell, he was livid. Quote, he was recalcitrant, extremely hostile, creating a verbal disturbance, refusing to follow rules, and not listening to any commands. He was yelling, screaming, being disrespectful, and shouting many profanities. People reports that Reiner was written up for his behavior and lost privileges for 5 days, including phone calls, visitation, and commissary access, according to the source. Joining me now to talk more about this case is Seth Zuckerman, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, now with Zuckerman Legal Group. Thank you for taking the time to be with us here on Law and Crime. The lying in wait part of this indictment that comes out, I know he lived at the property. Like, what would prosecutors have to prove to say that he was lying in wait and then allegedly went on to kill his parents?
So, lying in wait in California refers to a situation where an individual intentionally hides or waits for an opportunity to ambush the victim or surprise them. So, the prosecutors are going to need evidence that's not just shows that he killed them, but that he planned to do so and he waited in the home with the plan to do so. So, there must be some type of evidence, whether it's surveillance videos, whether it's text messages, whether it's things he told to other witnesses, whether they're diary entries, something that shows his state of mind at the time was more than just he planned to kill his parents. And this was that he ambushed them. Now, the new indictment doesn't explain how he was lying in wait or what the evidence is. And that's what I'm looking for moving forward. But there's clearly going to have to be some evidence that the prosecutors have to establish this new charge.
Right, because again, he lived on the property. I believe he lived in a guest house, and then Rob and Michele Reiner lived in the main home. But he was someone who was typically around. So it's like, what evidence do they have that can prove that he was lying in wait and then planning to allegedly do this? There's a lot of questions about his mental health and his past drug use, how that factors into what allegedly happened that night. At this point, and there's still a lot that we don't know, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot that's going to look into any sort of mental health treatment that he had and all of that. To this point, what stands out to you when it just comes to his past and how that could factor into potential challenges for the prosecution in this case?
Well, I actually think, Chris, that the prosecution charged him with lying in wait as a way to rebut the forthcoming psychiatric defense, right? Because this lying in wait, if they have evidence to prove it, shows he didn't just snap, right? That he planned to kill his parents. And not only did he plan to kill his parents, but he was waiting to ambush them with a surprise attack. So that he was thinking clearly in this plan while he was lying in wait, while he was surprising and ambushing them. And I think that this is evidence of his state of mind, right? The defense is always going to argue, well, he couldn't understand because of his psychological issues. Well, the prosecution is now trying to affirmatively rebut that with these new charges, and that's what I find to be the most interesting here.
And Nick was reportedly diagnosed with schizophrenia. And sadly, we've seen there are a lot of people that live their life with schizophrenia and they never commit a violent crime. But sadly, we have seen cases with people who have been diagnosed with that condition carry out some very violent offenses. When it comes to prosecuting, or even from the criminal defense side, like, how does that particular diagnosis potentially factor into all of this? And I know that, we were just talking about the mental health part of it, but I just think particularly schizophrenia and how that can play in front of a jury.
I mean, it could play in so many different ways. Everyone has experienced people who are suffering from all types of psychological issues, including schizophrenia, right? And so the question becomes, did he understand what he was doing at the time that he did it? And again, I think that's why the prosecutors actually brought this new indictment as a way to say, not only did he know what he was doing, but here's the evidence that we have to support that he didn't snap, right? That this wasn't an irrational decision. This wasn't in the heat of the moment, in the heat of passion, and he just had a psychological breakdown. They're saying we have evidence affirmatively that shows he intended to do this and that he intended to ambush and surprise them. And I'm waiting to see what that evidence is. Nobody knows what that evidence is, but that's what I'm seeing from this new indictment. And the schizophrenia and the psychological aspects of all of this will play a huge role. And I'm anticipating that's going to be a part of his defense, whether it's from the public defender or private defense counsel that he ends up retaining. That's going to be the defense. And I think the government is trying to get ahead of that.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about, paying for that defense, how it looks like, a hearing that's going to come up on Monday at the time that we're recording this. The timeline of this grand jury indictment. So he was, indicted, believe in July of this year. It just gets unsealed now. There was going to be a preliminary hearing in September. To my understanding, that's not happening anymore. Like, what do you make of that timeline of how all of this played out?
What I make of the timeline is the government has been considering their strategy moving forward with this case to trial. And one of those things is knowing that there's likely going to be a psychiatric defense. So I think the government got ahead of this and indicted him off a higher level. This is now a first-degree murder charge, which carries the potential death penalty, even though there is a moratorium currently in California, or life without parole. So the government wanted to charge him with this higher crime in order for him to face stiffer penalties, in order to get ahead of the psychiatric defense. But also, there's no need for a preliminary hearing now, right? Because now there's a new indictment. He just got arraigned on it, and they have to go through the process all over again. And so the old indictment no longer applies to this case, and the preliminary hearing in September, as you noted, will not happen.
You know, it's interesting because like right now, I think the trial that is top of mind for everybody, and I know it's a very, very different case, but you know, you have the Lindsay Clancy trial that's going on in Massachusetts, and you really see like the healthcare system being put on trial by the defense. And you see all of the information related to her mental health treatment in 2022, 2023. And then when I think of Nick Reiner, like here's someone who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then, you know, I imagine for whoever his defense attorney is going to be, like there's going to be a major investigation into medications he was on and all of that. Like as a defense attorney, like what does that actually look like of gathering that information if that's what his defense is going to be?
So what does that look like? So that looks like getting all of his mental health records from all of his prior providers, getting a list of medications that he's taken over the years, and also having him evaluated by a forensic psychiatric expert who could potentially issue a report and testify at trial. Now, if the defense does that, you're opening the door to his psychiatric history. The government, the prosecutors get a copy of all of those records, and they also get the opportunity to have him evaluated by their own expert. So there's a lot of experts that get involved if and when he serves notice of a psychiatric defense. But the defense attorneys from day one were gathering his psych records, reviewing them, having a consultant review them, looking at his medicines, and seeing what, if anything, they could prove based on his psychiatric history.
So, and you know, we'll see now with whatever happens next with this indictment on that criminal side. But then, you know, the question is like, not only what does his defense look like, but how's he going to pay for it? Who's going to end up being his attorney? He, you know, as a member of let's face it, very wealthy family, just based off of the success that his dad and his mom had in the film industry for such a long period of time, he has a trust fund. I don't think he has, you know, I know he like directed a film, but like didn't really himself seem to have a lot of money. A lot came from his parents. So there's about $1.5 million reportedly in this trust fund that he would like to use to pay for a defense. And then they'll have a hearing on Monday to try and determine that. How do you see that playing out with what we know at this point?
From what's been publicly reported, I think he's entitled to those funds. You know, from my understanding, that trust said that when he turned 30, he would get access to these funds, and he's clearly over 30. I don't think the Slayer statute or anything else actually is relevant here, because he was entitled to those funds separate and apart from his parents' death. So he should have inherited this money or had access to this money when he was 30. And it's not like these are life insurance benefits or something that's coming to fruition because of their death, right? These are funds that purportedly and he was supposed to have access to when he turned 30, and he should have access to use these funds however he sees fit. Obviously, the trustee disagrees with that, and that's why there is an upcoming hearing. But from my standpoint, legally, I don't think the Slayer statute applies here, and he should be entitled to whatever funds he was entitled to when he turned 30.
Does the fact that he's just accused of murder at this point, you know, no matter what people think happened inside the house, like he hasn't been convicted of anything, he's presumed innocent. And then you have this Slayer statute, which, you know, I feel like after the fact, you know, if he was found guilty and then that money, it seems like it applies there. Like, how does that work typically when it's someone who's accused of a crime as opposed to convicted?
See, again, I don't think I understand what you're getting at, Chris. I don't think that that's actually the relevant question, right? Because you're right. He's innocent until proven guilty. He's pled not guilty, and the case is moving forward. But I think the fact that he was entitled to the money regardless of this case, right? He was supposed to have inherited it when he turned 30, and for some reason or not, he didn't get the money from the trustee. So putting aside the fact that he's now accused of murdering his parents, he should have had that money to begin with. And legally they are withholding that money from him with no basis. That's his argument. And I think it's a pretty good argument. I don't think the fact that he's now accused of murdering his parents should have any role here in whether he's entitled to the funds that he should have gotten. Now, again, I don't think it also matters whether he gets convicted later on and he used those funds, because I think this is money that he was legally entitled to regardless. Again, this isn't life insurance proceeds that he got upon his parents' death, or something else that was triggered by his parents' death. This is funds that were supposedly triggered by him turning 30, which he did a couple years ago.
What will be like the arguments in this hearing on Monday? Like, what can we expect, as we kind of follow, like what would, from a trustee standpoint, what are they going to say, knowing that, on Nick's side, it is probably that argument of like, look, this was his money and he's not been convicted of a crime.
I think, the trustee is going to argue that he shouldn't inherit any money or benefit from any money from his parents' death and from him being the one behind his parents' death. And I think his argument, which I think is a good legal argument, is that I was entitled to this money a few years ago. I should have had this money already. And the fact that my parents' death died is irrelevant. And I'm entitled to these funds when I turn 30, and I should get these funds. Obviously, the trustee disagrees with that, and that's what the hearing is for. But I could see the arguments on both sides here.
And depending on how it shakes out, when, he was arrested, he, for a period of time, hired Alan Jackson, who's major name in criminal defense. He's just coming off of Karen Reed, and I'm sure that costs a lot of money to be able to get Alan Jackson to be your defense attorney. Say he goes with the public defender's office. Like, how does the defense look when you have Alan Jackson and you're paying for it yourself, or if he were to go through the public defender's office?
One of the main issues here, especially in a psychiatric defense case, is the ability to retain experts. Obviously, if he hires a private attorney and he pays whatever Alan Jackson's retainer fee is, he's going to also have to pay for private experts. Public defenders, of course, also have access to experts, but it's just a different roster of experts that you have access to. So not only is the attorney different, but there's also just different experts that are available to you. So that's what I'm looking for, is to what experts are retained here by the defense team to assist with not only just the psychiatric defense, any other defense that they're going to put forth that may require an expert witness.
And there's still so much we don't know after this indictment. We'll see what happens on Monday and where things go from here. Seth Zuckerman with Zuckerman Legal Group, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. Great to have you here on Law and Crime. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.